And we kind of ended off last week's lesson, even though it was shorter, around the time of 1909. And the purpose of starting or to ending last week's lesson around 1909 is because I wanted to set the foundation because this week, even though we're talking about Black California settlements, this is probably the heaviest week, mainly because we're covering, even though it's not the largest time span, we're probably covering the most events and the most going on around this time. So we're really starting to cover, even though, as we said before, there were already Black social and political movements before, during, and after the institution of slavery. We're really starting to cover a lot of these movements, and I want to start and first establish whether they be before slavery, but specifically after slavery. A lot of the social movements that we'll talk about, specifically the civil rights movement, the Pan-African movement, originally led by Marcus Garvey, and even some of the California movements that we really see, specifically specifically Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. These are very, very organized and very, like I said, very well put together social movements. These are not just a random group of people specifically coming together and saying, oh, we need to fight for whatever rights and or freedoms. Yes, there were definitely random people who were doing so in a more unorganized fashion. However, the civil rights movement, whether it be in the South and the Southern Baptist Convention under Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other people around him, or whether it be all the way on the other side of the country with Malcolm X and his movements, and also the Black Panther Party up in Oakland, and also someone in the Midwest in Chicago, what we really see is that a lot of these movements, like I said before, are extremely organized. They're put together and held together by extremely educated people, and they're essentially training people. Yes, these movements were not just you join the movement and you learn. These movements were heavily comprised by well-read and well-trained people to further the cause, essentially. But the reason why we're starting, and I said in my email that we were going to start technically at 1910, which I was technically right. However, I have to still remember or still mention that the base of today's lesson really starts actually in 1909, so just a year before. And the reason why I moved to 1909, and we ended off yesterday's lesson specifically with, and sorry about that, I'm actually, I like to tend to walk a bit more, especially when I do these lessons, so you might hear me walk around a bit. But the reason why we ended last week's lesson with the year 1909 specifically, and the founding of the NAACP, which, for those who are unacquainted, stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And we'll talk about the different phrases and or words that have been used to describe Black or African American people in America. But the reason why we start with that is because 1909 is really the start of the proliferation of these movements. Really the start, or the real kind of, not exact beginning, but we're really starting to see a lot of these movements start to pop up and really start to really gain their stride, especially going into the 60s and 70s, as we'll discuss. But let's start with 1909, like I said before. In 1909, specifically with members or with individuals I've mentioned, specifically people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and other very educated and very organized Black folk, the Talented 10 idea that we described, they established the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. And it was really not the first organization in which was really striving for what we would say legal equality for Black people within the United States, but it was also the first, I would say, very concerted effort to do so. And what we really saw coming on to 1909 and 1910 was that there was also another radical, not specific movement, but actually a movement of people happening from 1910 to 1960 that really is the backdrop of all these different social movements. And it's the main part of this part of the course because, as we'll describe, the Great Migration, which specifically is to define is the moving or migration of Black people, mainly in smaller towns in the South, to specific areas of either the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West Coast. And we'll also have to discuss at the same time. A lot of people get wrong that um, the Great Migration was only a migration out of the South. That is not exactly the case. The reason why I made it very clear that it was a great migration out of smaller cities in the South is because there were also Black Americans at the time who stayed in the South but moved to larger Southern municipalities, such as, for example, you had people who were living in smaller areas near the Mississippi Delta, specifically in Arkansas and smaller areas of Mississippi. They were actively moving to New Orleans, Louisiana. You also had individuals who were living in an area who moved to Houston and Dallas, Texas, and that's why you have a very large Black population in Houston and Dallas, Texas, alongside the previous population. You had individuals who were moving to Charlotte, North Carolina. You had individuals who were moving to Miami, Florida, who were moving to Tampa, Florida. You had people who were moving to Birmingham, Alabama. And as we'll discuss later on, that would later be the backdrop for a lot of what was going on in the civil rights movement. So to really make sure that we have a full understanding of the Great Migration, we have to understand that the Great Migration just wasn't everyone who was, everyone was fleeing the South. It was also because it was also a leaving smaller cities in the South for larger municipalities in the South as well. And the reason why we talk about the Great Migration, we have to talk about the Great Migration, like I said before, is it sets the backdrop for the civil rights movement. It sets the backdrop for other civil rights movements, specifically in California, specifically the Black Panther Party, and specifically Malcolm X, and his own interpretation of how Black Americans should succeed or should liberate themselves. So one of the other things that we have to talk about when it comes to the Great Migration is why and how did people move or were wanting to move out of the South? We ended last week on talking about Reconstruction. And as we kind of went over last week, Reconstruction was a difficult time for Black Americans because of the violence that they faced. But at the same time, we do also have to realize that violence was still very common before, during, and after Reconstruction. So at the same time, violence really wasn't the main factor keeping Black Americans or having Black Americans wanting to leave the South. That was already present. It was something that was already being dealt with, and unfortunately, it became very normalized. Violence really wasn't the reason. It was, like I said before, Reconstruction had absolutely wrecked the South from an economic standpoint. The South was not ripe for the taking, and the South really was not able to recover economically. And still to this day, you could argue that the South has not recovered from Reconstruction, which started in 1865. So because there was really not a lot of economic opportunities outside of sharecropping, and as we discussed last week, sharecropping was essentially a system very similar to slavery. A lot of people elected to move out of the South or out of places in the South that were really dependent on that agricultural labor. And at the same time, during this time, and we'll speak shortly about it, there was also what we call the first wave of major immigration into the United States. And what we really saw during the late 1800s to early 1900s is that we saw a couple of different groups start to immigrate to the Americas, specifically the East Coast, but also the West Coast, depending on which racial or ethnic group it was. So this is around the time you may be familiar in which you saw a lot of what we would call the Ellis Island arrivals. So you had people from Southern and Eastern Europe, specifically groups from Italy. And Italy at this time was not exactly a unified nation. Italy really, if you do know some Italian people, you might see some Italian people describe themselves as Sicilian or Italian, and that's because Sicily did not really become established into the country of Italy until very recently, actually. But what we really saw was that we saw, like I said, groups from Italy. We saw groups from Eastern Europe. So this means we saw groups from Russia and those neighboring countries. And then we also saw, like I said before, we saw people from Greece as well immigrate over. And we saw a lot of different southern and Eastern European groups come over. Alongside some of those southern and Eastern European groups, we also saw people typically for either purposes of labor, but also other purposes. And we'll talk about the railroads and things like that and what really attracted a lot of different people over. But we also had Chinese laborers come over from China. And a lot of Chinese immigrants, of course, would come into the Northeast, specifically New York. But as you now know, and as you probably have seen if you've ever been to San Francisco or Northern California, a lot of Chinese immigrants came into what we now know as San Francisco, establishing communities such as Chinatowns, etc. And what we have to realize is during this time, and the reason why I bring this up, even though this is a Black American history class, is that a lot of people were moving into the North, and at the same time, as opposed to the South, where there's a decreasing amount of need for labor, and there's basically an economy that's starting to fail, the North continues to boom, especially with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution had already been kind of in the background during, especially a bit before the Civil War, but especially during and after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution was starting to change America not only into an economic powerhouse, but was turning the North into a place in which there was a need for labor, and there was a need for people to work in those factories. So the Industrial Revolution was a time in which you saw industries like manufacturing, or you saw factories, or you saw the proliferation of what we now know as a large city or a large metropolis. And because of this, there's an economic need, or there's a labor need for Black Americans or any other individuals to move to cities such as New York, of course, Chicago, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, etc. So what we really saw during this Great Migration period was that we saw Black Americans start to move to, like I said, cities like these. So like I said before, we saw Black Americans not only move to cities that were larger cities in the South, like Birmingham, Tampa, Florida, Miami, Florida, New Orleans, Dallas, Houston, etc. But we also saw Black Americans start to move westward, north, and to the Midwest. So, of course, when we talk about Midwest cities, we see large populations of Black Americans in Chicago and Minneapolis. We see large populations of Black Americans in New York. We see large populations of Black Americans in Philadelphia, and in California, specifically San Francisco, especially Oakland, and parts of Los Angeles, and later on, as we'll discuss, parts of what we now know as the Inland Empire, but that would more happen towards the end of the Great Migration. So to define, like I said before, the Great Migration was a period starting in 1910 and ending around the late 60s. The reason why, like I said, the reason why the Great Migration happened is not only because of no longer benefiting a lot of Black Americans, but also there was an economic and labor need for Black Americans to come to areas of the North, Midwest, and West. So when we talk about the Great Migration, we also have to realize that the Great Migration was not exactly, there was an economic need and there was money to be made. But at the same time, we have to realize that, and as we've really been talking about through this course, that the North was not very welcoming, as a lot of people assume throughout history. And the way that we talked about the North, not in this course, but the way that the North has been talked about in other courses, is that the North was very friendly, or was, in a way, it was the exact opposite of the South when it came to attitudes towards, you know, having racial minorities or ethnic minorities in the North. However, that was not exactly the case. Like I said before, and this is also why I mentioned this influx of immigration in the North, was that there was no black American into especially areas, but there were also, like I said, Chinese, even Irish immigrants, and South and Eastern European immigrants coming into the area. And the reason why I mentioned this was there was sense among what we would call nativists. And the reason why I mention the word nativist is because I'm not going to assign the moniker of Native Americans to descendants of those who came over on the Mayflower, because that would be incorrect. However, the reason why I use the word nativist is because that was a term that has been used historically and is continuing to be used, is because there was a group of white Americans, not only in the South, but a group of white Americans in the North as well, who were becoming disgruntled what they saw as a dilution of the population, especially in the North. And what they saw was there were a group of native people who were heavily displeasured by Irish immigrants coming in, southeastern European immigrants coming in, Eastern European immigrants coming in, and Black Americans coming from the South. And what we really saw at this time was this nativist sentiment of, we believe this is our land, you should not be here, led to groups spawning, and a couple different groups spawning. Of course, one group that we're probably very familiar with is the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan, of course, is in the South, but what we saw was, and this goes back to that duality of the North and South that really does not exist, is that what we really saw was there were nativist groups in the South, and the Ku Klux Klan very much exists in the South, and it existed much more out in the open. Of course, there were individuals who kind of did so in a very covert method, but at the same time, it was much more acceptable to be out in the open about someone's activities in a group like the Ku Klux Klan in the South. However, what we saw in the North was the North was very covert in its bias and its racism. They were very much not willing to be out in the open about their biases or their feelings about what they saw as an influx of different people or different populations coming into the area. But at the same time, there was still that feeling of being disgruntled about it. So not only would the Ku Klux Klan be established, but there was this very famous party that no longer exists, but still has a political legacy in this country, called the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party was an anti-immigrant. It was also anti-industrial revolution, because they saw the Industrial Revolution and the proliferation of factories as a method of essentially bringing more people into the country who they did not prefer to be in the country. And they were also a party that was heavily, what we would say is a heavily nationalist or heavily protectionist party. And what I mean by that was, of course, they had what we would say they were heavily invested in the economics of the United States only, but they wanted to make sure that the United States was not actively engaging in international policy and international trade. They wanted to essentially have the United States stay to itself and not get involved in future conflicts, specifically World War I. So because of the large influx, and because especially because of what was going on with Black Americans moving across the country, you had these groups pop up, the Ku Klux Klan, the Know Nothing Party, but you also had other groups pop up, which are sinister, but were also used to basically quell and start to essentially, in a way, how should I say, separate emerging Black communities in the West the Northeast and the Midwest. And these communities, or what we now know as, and a lot of you, depending on if you live in one, you may or may not be surprised, HOAs start to pop up around the 1910s to 1960s as a response to Black Americans moving into traditionally all white neighborhoods. This specifically is a practice that really is very popular in California, specifically Southern California, in response to Black Americans moving to Compton, Los Angeles, and cities surrounding those areas. And we'll talk about, especially when it comes to Compton, California, the vitriol that a lot of Black Americans were met with at the time. But let's get back to what was going on specifically in the 1910s. So in the 1910s, like I said, it was the Industrial Revolution. It was a time in which we saw a severe labor need happening. And that's why we saw a lot of Black Americans start to move in these different areas that I speak of. But it was also a time culturally in which the United States was starting to become what we now know as the superpower it is today. The United States was really starting to establish itself economically, but also establish itself on the world stage as a superpower that can compete with the traditional superpowers of Western Europe, and also other East Asian countries as well, China specifically. But what we really saw at the time was, in a way, the United States still had that very, we don't want to get involved with whatever the Europeans are doing, especially going up to World War I. So instead, the United States, and we talked about this concept last week, but I wanted to reintroduce it because it becomes very important. But instead, the United States continues to be on its ideals of manifest destiny. And to redefine from last week, manifest destiny is the doctrine or the idea that the United States should expand its territory all the way from its original territorial holdings in the eastern United States, all the way to the western United States. So by 1910, this had already happened. By 1910, there were only really two states that had not been acquired by the Union at this time, and those states specifically are Alaska and Hawaii, and eventually until the 1950s and 60s, they would eventually acquire those states. But by this time, manifest destiny had been almost fully realized, but also by this time, the United States started to see manifest destiny as not only going from coast to coast, but also getting itself involved in some of the holdings in the Pacific Islands. So this is during the time, as we may be familiar, the Spanish had territorial acquisitions not only in what we now know as Texas, California, Arizona, etc., the Southwest region, but we also saw that the Spanish had territorial acquisitions in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Mainly what we would see or now know as the Philippines, Cuba, etc. And the United States, not only having acquired formerly Spanish territories like Texas, etc., really saw that they had an opportunity to further expand their territory into the Pacific Islands. And around this time, this is when the United States really starts to have dominion and it starts to have control over a lot of these Pacific Islands, as well as some of these Caribbean islands. So this is when the United States, and around this time, starts to like I said before, starts to involve itself with the affairs of Hawaii, as well as the Philippines, and some of the Pacific Islands as well, including Fiji, Samoa, and other islands in this area. And during this time, like I said, the United States starts to establish itself as a superpower, not only economically because of the Industrial Revolution and its production capabilities, but also from a territorial sense. Traditionally, especially amongst European powers, the mark of one's ability or the mark of a country's power was how much territory it held outside of its own essentially home territory. And during this time, the largest empire was still the British Empire, with its essentially with its acquisitions in Southeast Asia as well as other areas of the world. But the United States was starting to become one of those countries that had territorial acquisitions of outside of its traditional borders, as we would say. But during this time, the United States also was also very not observant, but was very, in a way, unwilling to get itself involved into World War One. And to briefly explain World War One, and I'm not going to explain it much, but as to not take up too much time, but what was essentially happening was that during this period, Europe had essentially entrenched itself into war of its own. Europe was going through a time in which, like I said before, it was actively colonizing other areas, or specifically Africa, other continents, and it was starting to establish, many European countries were starting to threaten themselves. And what we really saw was what we now call modern day Serbia. We saw the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Serbian nationalists. And what we saw was not only was the traditional European power structure of acquiring multiple different nations or acquiring multiple different territories starting to become very, very unstable, but we also saw that European alliances were starting to entangle themselves, and meaning that once the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, then you had, for example, you had different countries who were allied with with either Serbia or other countries starting to join the war as a result of that. So World War One was really started by, like I said, competing European powers and their inability slash really, like I said before, they're constantly trying to show their muscle against each other. These are powers that are, like I said, they're acquiring multiple territories. They are actively in multiple alliances, but that means if you're in multiple alliances and someone declares war against your ally, then automatically you would have to join that war. And what we saw was Europe was really embroiling or was starting to endanger its own continent through war. And the United States did not want to be involved. The United States waits multiple years to join World War One and was known to be very lazy in its efforts. The name Doughboys specifically was given to the United States because it was told by specifically European powers that when the United States finally joined the side of what we know as the Alliance, or what we now know as the powers of what was then known as the Soviet Union. Well, not the Soviet Union, as they established themselves as the Soviet Republic after the war, but specifically the alliance of Britain, then known as Russia, and France, had really said that the United States came in, specifically their soldiers came in unfit, lazy, and in a way, doughy in a way. A lot of them said that they looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, which is a reason as to why the Pillsbury Doughboy is so famous in American culture. But what we really saw during this time, as you may or may not know, whenever a war happens in a country starts to basically reap the economic benefits of a war. Once you're able to produce things like weapons, planes, etc., attached to a war, then you have more and more people, more and more economic need, and then you have more commerce flowing through the country. So you have a situation in which not only is there an industrial revolution and there needs to be labor coming into the Northeast and other areas of the country, but there also is the war effort that is bringing more and more Black Americans outside of the South or into larger Southern cities to produce these goods that are greatly needed. And then also at the same time, you have Black Americans who are joining the war effort specifically, and to address this, and this persists until the Vietnam and Korean War. but there are specific black only theaters or black only regiments because there was really there was no admitting or there was no equality even in the military for black Americans, but at the same time there was still a feeling, or there was still this sentiment in the country, and it was a very racist sentiment, that black American, whether they be soldiers or whether they even be doctors or lawyers, did not have equal potential compared to white soldiers, doctors, and lawyers. So there was still this stigma around black Americans serving in the military. And so during the World War I effort, we really saw black Americans be separated into their own specific into their own specific regiments and things like that. And we'll talk about the Tuskegee Airmen as well, in terms of not only were black Americans separated into their own specific regiments, but they were very effective and they were very organized and they're essentially valued resources to the United States military, because a lot of black Americans use World War I and World War II as basically a proving ground to show that their abilities were on par with what was expected with them. But during World War I, we also saw, we really didn't see in the 1910s a time of establishing specifically black cities that we now know, specifically in California. But as we move on to the 20s really starts to bring more black Americans out of the South and out of agricultural work. And the reason why, and if you're familiar, specifically the late 20s, early 30s, is the time of the Great Depression. And the Great Depression happened for a couple of different reasons. From a Wall Street perspective, from a New York perspective, it happens because so many people were taking out what we call credit. Credit is essentially, as you're probably familiar with, the ability to pay for something after you have purchased it, or the ability to not pay for something with hard money. So many people were taking out credit because there was no limit on credit then. However, because of Black Tuesday, as we now call it, Black Tuesday showed that credit was no longer a system that could be upheld to the current way it was being used. And the reason why I say this is because back in the 1920s, there was no limit on credit. And I will tell you the reason why there was no limit on credit was because there was no system of what we now know as a credit score or financial references in purchasing, whether it be furniture, homes, or any other large purchases. The establishment of a credit score and the establishment or the cracking down on credit as a means of purchase really only happens not because of the Great Depression and Black Tuesday, but it happens because Black Americans started to have the financial capital to start to use credit to purchase things like homes. And because Black Americans having financial capital was seen as a threat to the United States, that is when we actually see the institution of credit scores. So you would think that people would say, we need to have credit scores, or we need to start instituting credit scores because people are going essentially willy-nilly with the use of credit scores. That was not actually the thought process. It was only because Black Americans were starting to have financial capability in the country that credit scores were starting to be used. So in the 1920s, not only is it the Great Depression that's being caused by this rampant use of credit, but it is also something called the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl you may be familiar with. A lot of the practices that the native people of this land have used was specifically to make sure that they were not overusing or abusing the soil of this land. However, because the United States was rapidly industrializing, the population of the United States was rapidly growing, the people who were now growing food and or crops on the land were not concerned about the health of the soil. Because of that, they had essentially left the soil barren by overplanting and by not instituting policies and or practices such as crop rotation, as well as properly using specific crops during the seasons in which they should have been used. So specifically, what we know as the plains, which would be Nebraska, Kansas, and what we call the middle of the country, Missouri, etc., Iowa, and the South had an event called the Dust Bowl. And because of the way that the soil had been abused by multiple years, nearly almost 100 years of overplanting, the lack of crop rotation, and just a lack of knowledge about the land itself, there was essentially a large dust storm that came in, making it unavailable to go outside. You could not go outside because the dust bowl or the dust storm was making it physically unable to go outside. And two, because you couldn't go outside, and also because the soil was essentially barren, you could not plant anything. So like I said, not only was it Reconstruction that made farming and agriculture not as lucrative as it once was, but you could not actually physically plant anything because of the Dust Bowl. So during this time, you had not only a migration of not only former farmers from Kansas, Missouri, and things like that, and also from the South, but you also had Black Americans who were sharecroppers whose labor was no longer needed during the 1920s because of the Dust Bowl. And now you have even more compared to the 1910s, when you have people who were coming out of the South because there were no longer economic opportunities available for a lot of people. But now you had even more people leaving because of the Dust Bowl and the inability to actually still make at least some money on crops and things like that. So now you have, from the 1910s, people leaving either small southern cities to go to larger southern cities, and the Midwest, of the Northeast and the West. And then now you have all of these people in the 1920s and the early 30s start to leave all these traditional agricultural areas because there was no ability to make money whatsoever anymore. So during the 1920s and 30s, we also see, and we'll talk about this more once we get on to what I'm calling now the cultural unit of this course. But during the 1920s and 30s, you start to see that despite the Great Depression really affecting what you would call white America during this time, because like I said, there was an overuse or an abuse of credit. What we saw was a lot of Black Americans were starting to establish communities of economic success of their own. So we're going to talk about a couple different neighborhoods, but this was really happening specifically in the South and the Northeast. So in the 1920s, this was what we would call before the Great Depression, and even after the Great Depression and during the Great Depression for Black Americans, this was actually a time of financial success. This was a time in which you saw settlements and you saw areas in New York, for example, Seneca Village. Seneca Village is what we now know as Central Park, and it was a thriving Black community that was really started by, and it was also continued to be empowered by people who were moving from the South or Black Americans who already been living in that area. And what we saw was there's something in government, or there's a concept in government called eminent domain. And eminent domain is essentially a doctrine that says that the government has the power, if they want to establish or build a project, has the ability to take private land away from a group of people or someone to enact that project. And what we see throughout history, especially when it comes to Black American people, is that the concept of eminent domain is nearly almost abused by multiple different people as a method of taking away that land for other reasons. And the area now known as Seneca Village, or previously known as Seneca Village, is now what we know as Central Park. Before Central Park, it was a thriving Black community that was there, that was economically sound, even during the Great Depression, when multiple people in the country were struggling. Now, that is not to say that there were Black Americans in the country who were not struggling during the Great Depression. Like I said before, there were Black American farmers, and there were other Black people in the country who were still staying in those areas that were affected by the Dust Bowl, and they were seeing a large economic hardship during the time. But like I said before, what we were also seeing was you were seeing the thriving of other Black communities. Now we're going to really go on to not only just settlements in the North. It isn't just Seneca Village in New York, it's also Harlem. And then Harlem is also the setting for what we would see from the 1920s to the 1960s of the Harlem Renaissance. And there is a unit that we have on that, so I'm not going to speak too much on that. But the Harlem Renaissance was really was not only supported by just influx of art throughout the region, but it was also supported by the amount of Black professionals that you had who were able to support the Harlem Renaissance. Because if you don't know, to be an artist, you can't just obviously start to create art and then you'll get famous or blah, blah, blah. You need people or patrons or curators to actively support you in the creation of said art. So, because there was what we would call almost an influx of Black economic power in these regions, that is what made the Harlem Renaissance actually able to happen. And then next, you also had a situation in which you saw not only in New York in the Northeast, you saw thriving Black settlements, but you also saw in the South. Like I said before, Black Americans during the Great Migration did not move all the way out of the South. They just moved out of areas in which were not economically viable anymore. So that means for Black people who stayed in the South, they moved to areas such as Atlanta, even as far as Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Charlotte, North Carolina, like I mentioned before, Miami, Florida, and Tampa, Florida, Birmingham, Alabama, New Orleans, Louisiana, and areas such as those. And what we saw in the South, and I mentioned Tulsa specifically, is that we see a thriving community, also known at the time as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And at this time, like I said, in the 1920s and during this time, you saw financial panic in what is called Wall Street or the general Wall Street in New York. You had people, the stock market actively crashed, people were using too much credit, and then you saw so many people become unemployed, put out on the streets, etc. But at the same time, you then saw in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that there was a successful and thriving Black community there. Not just a thriving Black Wall Street of commerce, but you saw people and Black people start to establish their own communities. You saw neighborhoods being established. You saw business owners starting to come up. And then you also started to see that there was also a situation in which people were seeing that why in New York is there a situation of there are so many people who are losing their jobs or there are people who are being disadvantaged by the economy, but in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of all places, established by people who were either the sons and daughters of former sharecroppers or even formerly enslaved people themselves, there's this essentially rich city being established. And Tulsa is not the only place in which this was happening in the South. If you know, in specifically the Atlanta, Georgia area, there's a place called Lake Lanier, or we know it now as Lake Lanier. And Lake Lanier has kind of become a almost kind of a mythological setting in which, if you're familiar, there's this kind of joke, especially for the people who live in the area, don't go to Lake Lanier. And Lake Lanier now is this water park. It's this giant lake in which people go out. However, Lake Lanier is not an actual lake. It is a former community called Oscarville. And Oscarville was very similar to Tulsa, Oklahoma, in which it was a thriving Black city that was upheld by its own Wall Street in some format. It was a city that was established by formerly enslaved people, by freed Black Americans, by a multitude of people. And then the United States military eventually came into those cities, and specifically Oscarville, and actually essentially destroyed the homes that were there, used the concept of eminent domain, like what happened in Seneca Village, or now what we know as Central Park, and turned a once thriving community into an entire lake. So basically, the former city of Oscarville is. And you actually, if you've gone there before, the buildings and all the infrastructure in Oscarville is still there. It's just under multiple feet of water. And the reason why people say it's what we would say haunted, or it's now become a stuff of legend, is because Lake Lanier or Oscarville has seen multiple people go out to the lake and never return. And it's said that it is essentially, a situation in which people who were formerly living there are disgruntled by the fact that they were essentially forced to leave their homes by the United States government and the attempts to create a lake. And there was also a similar thing that was happening within Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma, like I said before, was a thriving black city, and it was also thriving from an economic standpoint. And because of that, and because of the comparisons that they had to New York, and because there was a an an already anti-black sentiment, especially towards very thriving black communities, there was a target on Tulsa, Oklahoma's back. And that would eventually lead to the Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre. And it was essentially not only the slaying and killing of the inhabitants of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but it was the firebombing and destruction of the city itself. And as you may be familiar with, there is actually at this point there was an attempt through the federal government to give those who were survivors of the Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre, which unfortunately there no longer is because the last survivor of said massacre actually just passed away. But there was an attempt to give reparations to those who had survived and or who were essentially threatened by said massacre. And what we saw was that there was a situation in which the United States government actively denied said requests for reparations. And the reason why was, to a certain point, there were no survivors, as I said before, and unfortunately, to this day, there were no reparations for the individuals who survived the Tulsa Race Massacre. And you had to kind of describe more about said massacre. There was a white mob who went into the city and started to assault, kill, slay multiple business owners, multiple prominent members of the community, set buildings on fire, firebombed other buildings, and essentially ransacked and destroyed the entire community out of what we would say almost a jealousy that, like I said before, there was a thriving black community amongst a very chaotic United States going through a depression. And that did not really settle right with a lot of like this nativist or this very anti-black sentiment in the country. And what we will continue to see is that the thriving of black communities, when they really start, especially from the 20s to the 60s, really is not very well accepted amongst others in the country. And what we see is we can see this continued destruction of a lot of these communities, and we see it in different ways. It starts in the 20s to the 30s in a very chaotic and a very, how should we say, in a very specific and, blatant way. It is a mob coming into a community like either Oscarville or Tulsa, using eminent domain or using, a mob to eventually destroy a community. But what we see in the 40s to the 60s, especially with the establishment of the FBI and CIA, is a more calculated approach to destroying communities in which the physical community would still stand. However, the spirit of a community is broken. And as we get to the 60s, we'll talk about the war on drugs. And I specifically, in the email that I emailed you today, I actually have a full-on, it's about 30 pages. And I'm very, like I said, I like to write and talk. And it's basically it's an essay that I myself have written about how the Great Migration and the war on drugs are connected, and how the war on drugs was used to disempower a lot of these black settlements after Tulsa, Oklahoma, after Oscarville, things like that. But let's go on to the 40s and World War II, since we don't have much time. In the 40s, like I said before, the 40s was, like I said, it was a continuation of the Great Migration. And in the 40s, what we really saw, of course, the 40s was not only a time in which during the 1910s, the United States not only reestablished itself, well, not reestablished, it established itself as a global power, but also during this time, it established itself on the world stage. During the 1910s, the world started to change in terms of who was the superpower. The original superpower in the 1910s, or the two superpowers in the 1910s, was Germany and Britain. Britain would remain essentially the number one superpower until after World War II. However, Germany had been what we would say emasculated. If you're familiar with World War II history, after Germany, which was known as Prussia at the time, lost in the war, Germany would essentially go through a process in which it had to pay reparations to areas such as France, Britain, etc. It was heavily disempowered militarily, and it was also heavily. It was emasculated in a sense. It was not able to function as a country because economically it was paying reparations to other countries. Militarily, it was not able to actively have a military. And then it was also going through some other cultural conflicts. And that, unfortunately, would lead to the rise of the Third Reich or Adolf Hitler. But as we go on into the 40s, what we see with Black Americans is that it was really a continuation of migration out of small southern cities into larger southern cities, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. And what we continue to see is that in the 40s, not only do we see Black Americans still serving in World War II, but we continue to see the segregation of the military in World War II, which, like I said, continues to persist up until the Cold War, up into the Korean and Vietnam War. And during this time, we have multiple, like I said, we have multiple Black regiments, but we also have the proliferation of aerial warfare. Now, aerial warfare had really become established specifically in World War I. And World War I is very interesting because World War I was known as the war to end all wars, which is now, in hindsight, we know that's not the case because there was another World War and there were multiple wars after. But World War I is significant because it changed the technology of how war was waged. Traditionally, before this, and you could imagine in your heads, before World War I, war was committed in a very almost theatrical way. It was the kind of almost American Revolution style of war in which you would have a drummer, you would have a trumpetist, you would have musicians, and then you would have a musket, and then you would shoot people from 10 paces, etc., etc. World War I changed the way that war was waged because it took out all the theatrical pomp and circumstance and replaced it with probably some of the most brutal and inhumane tactics you have probably ever seen. First, it was not only aerial warfare, so people were actively in planes and jets, using that as methods of war, but it was the beginning of trench warfare, where instead of actively being on the ground, you would be in a trench shooting at each other, and then to essentially get to the other person or the other country's trench, you would run through gunfire, or you would run through bullets, and most people wouldn't survive. And then you had chemical warfare, where people were using mustard gas, and then you had other forms of warfare it simply changed the way, like I said, war was waged. And in the 1940s, it continued that practice during World War II. Not only did you have the proliferation of chemical warfare, but as we would know, which would eventually end the war, you had the developing of the nuclear bomb. And the nuclear bomb was not only it has changed the way that we wage war, but it has changed the way that countries respond to each other. It has changed the entire world. But going back to Black Americans during this conflict, the proliferation of aerial warfare had become, like I said, it had become even more common than it was in World War I. And during this time, there was a sentiment that not only was the military segregated, and if Black Americans served in the Army, that they had to serve in Black-only regiments, but if they did serve, they were not allowed to fly planes. There was still this sentiment in America, especially in the military, that Black Americans were not intelligent enough to fly a plane. However, what we saw was, and it was actually quite interesting that was the rhetoric going around, is because one of the first people, not just women, but one of the first people to actively engage in flight, and this was outside of the military, was a Black woman. But during this time, there was a sentiment that not only should Black Americans be in their own regiment, but there was a sentiment that essentially that Black people should not serve in any form of the Air Force. But during this time, what actually would happen was we would have a specific regiment called the Tuskegee Airmen. And the Tuskegee Airmen was an all black regiment that saw not only a groundbreaking performance during this time, but also saw a groundbreaking and historical change in the military in which black people were actually allowed to fly planes because, like I said before, there was a sentiment that that was something that we could not do. And the Tuskegee Airmen are also very, and you might have heard me speak of the name of the city of Tuskegee, Alabama on multiple occasions. And Tuskegee, Alabama is probably one of the most historically rich cities in America for Black history. And I say this because not only did it produce the Tuskegee Airmen, it also produced the Tuskegee Institute that was established by Booker T. Washington as one of the first technical schools and one of the first institutions to give people the training to actively be in fields in which you work with your hands, such as blacksmiths, stonemasons, etc. But also, Tuskegee also has I don't want to say rich, but has a very large history in which the government has come in and actively experimented medically on specifically Black people. And I'm going to use this as a moment to talk about the Tuskegee experiments. The Tuskegee experiments were essentially a way to establish a cure and or some way or of treating the disease. It's a sexually transmitted disease called syphilis. When the Americans or when European settlers first came to the country, syphilis was probably one of the biggest medical obstacles. It was one of the most, especially in the force and in many cases assaults of native peoples in the area. A lot of European settlers or colonizers started to develop syphilis in response to their actions or activities on this land. And syphilis had continued to plague a lot of the descendants of a lot of these people. So in order to find a cure or treatment for syphilis, the United States government came in and specifically started to experiment and in many ways basically gave specifically Black men, but also Black women syphilis as a method of trying to find some type of cure. And this did not yield for a cure, but what it saw was the death, abuse, and dehumanization of multiple Black men and women in Tuskegee, Alabama. And the Tuskegee experiments was not the first or only establishment of the United States government coming in to a Black community and using that as an opportunity for scientific experimentation, and then not telling said community of scientific experimentation, not compensating them either, or not treating them after said experimentation goes haywire. And what we saw with the Tuskegee experiment was that we saw this continued pattern of the government coming in and abusing Black people and using them as a form of experiment. And because of the way that Black people had been treated previously in the country, there was no way in which Black Americans were given recourse for the way that they were treated. But let's move on. Like I said before, I know we're kind of going quick, but I'm trying to get through everything. Let's get on to the 50s. And the 50s was a very interesting time, as I say, because the 50s was the establishment and the start of the United States being not the sole superpower, but the superpower of the world. Now, the United States, like I said, does not become the sole superpower until the early 1990s. And we'll talk about the reason why. As you may be familiar with, after World War II, the United States essentially ends the war through the bombing of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, forces Japan to surrender and forces them to no longer have a military or no longer have a military that is actively conducting any sort of action. So one, Japan is disempowered as a country. Two, the United Kingdom or Britain is economically disempowered after being, and also disempowered from an infrastructural level after being bombed on multiple occasions by the Germans. The Germans are also have been defeated, so therefore the Germans are no longer a superpower. The French were also bombed on multiple occasions by the Germans, and therefore, essentially, to establish this without going on about every single country in Europe, Europe had essentially destroyed itself. And this led for two different superpowers to come up. Even though Russia, which had then established itself as the Soviet Union, Russia established itself as a communist or a socialist society after they had withdrew themselves from World War One and had essentially usurped their own monarchy. And during this time, what we saw of the USSR, or the Socialist Republic of Russia, and its satellite states, was that Russia, even though had the most fatalities during World War II, still remained with the most territories after World War II. Now, at the same time, the United Kingdom had its territories still in India and Africa, but the Soviet Union, out of most countries in Europe, stayed the most stable. And then because, like I said, Europe was not only financially, but also from an infrastructural point, completely destroyed, the United States will come around as the other force throughout the nation. So during this time of the 1950s all the way to 1991 was the time of what we would call a bipolar Earth. And by bipolar, I don't mean a mental condition. I mean there are only two superpowers on the Earth at the time, and that is the Soviet Union and the United States. And during this time, the United States would really start to make itself a superpower, not only economically after the war, and World War II would bring the United States out of the Depression, but it will also establish itself as a diplomatic power, specifically with the establishment of the United Nations. And the United Nations was established after World War II as a method to basically have more diplomatic control and power to prevent another world war. And the United States not only created the United Nations, but it also created the United Nations Security Council. And the United Nations Security Council essentially established itself as a method of, and it's comprised by the victors of World War II. So the Security Council is the most powerful organization in the United Nations. So it's essentially the most powerful organization of our international government. And the Security Council is occupied by by powers that won World War I. So it's occupied by the United States, France, Russia, excuse me, and it's occupied by those victors. And the United States has a veto power over what is enacted or what goes through the United Nations, as it is not only a founder, but it is also a creator of the Security Council. So the United States, for example, if let's say the country of Turkey says they want to pass a law saying that the United Nations must actively feed everyone on the planet, the United States can come in, and it's actually done this in real life, can actually come in and say, no, we veto that, and therefore, if almost every single other country votes for that, the United States can come in and say, that's not going to happen. And the United States has basically established itself as a power through this diplomatic power and economic power. It will eventually later establish the North American Trade Organization through NATO. It would also establish multiple other multilateral organizations or multilateral agreements in which the United States started to really establish itself as a superpower. It started to establish bases outside of the country, and the United States has nearly a military base in almost every single country besides, as we know, some of its adversaries. But what we really see during the 1950s as well is we can see this continued, like I said, the continuation of the Great Migration, but specifically in California from the 50s to the 60s, we see the establishment or proliferation of Black California settlements, specifically in a couple cities. I am going to be very careful about the phrasing I use when it comes to this, because Los Angeles is a both a city and a county that encapsulates multiple neighborhoods and towns and cities in it. So I'm going to use very specific neighborhoods and cities within Los Angeles when I describe this. So in California specifically, in specifically the Bay Area, more towards Northern California and Central California, the main Black California settlement, or the main city that sees a large Black population, is Oakland, California. I'm not going to speak more just because I know we don't have much time left. I am going to call an audible and say we do not have enough time to cover the civil rights movement, and that will be for next week. But what we see with Oakland is we see the rise of the Black Panther Party there, but I won't talk much about it because we're going to leave that for next week, so we can give more detail to that later. And then during more south to California, we see settlements that we're familiar with now. So we see the settlements of Compton, California, Watts, California, South Central California, and other parts of Los Angeles. But outside of Los Angeles, especially in the 60s, we see the establishment of two Inland Empire cities as either Black majority cities or cities with large Black populations that are thriving. Specifically, what we're more familiar with now as San Bernardino, California, and Moreno Valley, California. And during this time, we are seeing not only more and more people move out to California as people have, like I said, as the country has been enriched and more people have the economic capability and means to move to California or other areas of the country. But we're seeing that these cities in California, these settlements, become thriving hubs of Black wealth and Black success. So I think, especially if we've been from California, as someone who lived right next to Compton growing up, there has been this perception that Compton is a neighborhood that has been thrown into poverty. It's a neighborhood that was never really economically successful, and it was a neighborhood or city that was riddled with crime. That was not always the case. Compton never really ran into that problem until the 90s, even the mid 90s. Compton originally was established actually as as a suburb that was really funded by the oil industry. There in the north, or kind of the higher, or not even mountains, but the hills of Compton, there was a rich oil resource, and that really brought multiple oil companies, but also brought multiple workers out to Compton. And originally, Compton was a majority, almost all white suburb. And because of this, Compton was really, at the time, and this is the story of a lot of suburbs in this area. The first, if you're actually familiar, the first quote-unquote suburb was established in California, actually very close to where I grew up and where I was raised. It's a city called Lakewood, California. And Lakewood, California was established as the first suburb in America. Before the establishment of the suburb, the United States was set up in a way in which you would either live on a farm, or you live in a rural area, or you'll live in the city. The suburb is what we call the in-between. It's where urban sprawl takes place. Urban sprawl being, instead of having very tall buildings that you would live in, you would kind of spread that out and have one-story or two-story houses that are spread out instead of multiple-story buildings that people would live in. And you have, space to have a backyard, etc. During this time, what we really see is we see that these suburbs, which are majority white or primarily white, or in some cases all white, we see Black people coming from, other areas of the country coming to specifically Compton, California. And we see, you might have heard of this concept of white flight. And it's really, a lot of people talk about it mainly pertinent to New York and cities in Harlem, but it's more important and more pertaining to what happens in the suburbs. So as Black Americans start to move into Compton for that, like I said, those rich opportunities in the oil industry, there is kind of this feeling amongst the white residents that they will no longer live in an all-white community because there are Black people coming in. And what we also see is that there's this feeling amongst white people that black people are starting to take over not only Compton, but the state of California. So what happens in Compton is not only do we see what is called white flight, which is where white individuals, after a certain amount of black people enter a community, start to leave that community because of feelings of racism or whatever they may be. There's also something in which we call redlining, and redlining is a system of multiple different practices in which a black person may be denied the ability to attain a home loan, or their communities may be zoned in which even though California had no official system of segregation, they were essentially segregated into black and white communities through basically by the ability to not be able to attain a home loan or even buy a home in a predominantly white community. So what we saw in Compton when Compton started to become a majority black community, and by the time of the 1970s, it became almost a 90% black community. During this time, we see multiple white families start to leave, and what we also see in California is that by this process of redlining, by the process of denying home loans, by other processes, there are certain communities in certain cities, or there are almost entire cities in which black Americans or black people or African Americans are not allowed to live in. And this is the case for a lot of different cities throughout California. And this is even the case for the very city that a lot of us who are on this call live in Redlands, California. Specifically in Redlands, as you may be familiar, there is the biggest divide in Redlands is between the North and the South. And we associate the South in Redlands as the very put together area, the rich area of hills and homes and things like that. However, what we saw, or what we assume of the North is the less economically empowered area. It might have more issues with crime, or it might have more issues, or it doesn't have as fancy houses, or it doesn't have as many trees, etc. But that was actually by design, because during this time, not only were black people moving to Redlands, or black people moving to this area were not allowed to live, or were not given the home loans to live in South Redlands. Economic disempowerment of North Redlands, where a majority of black people in Redlands lived, was not afforded to them. There was not proper upkeep of areas in North Redlands. There was not proper development of the economy in North Redlands by the city, and there were not very many people who were allowed to live in South Redlands if they were not white. I even say this to myself. I even have personal experience with this. As some of you may know, I've actually come to Redlands because my grandfather originally lived out here, and he moved here in, I would say, the mid to late 90s. And during the time in South Redlands, he lived on Irish Street in South Redlands, and he was the only black man and or black family to live in South Redlands in that area for years. And we even still see that today, where a majority of the black community living in Redlands to this day still lives in North Redlands. Now, there are more black people living in South Redlands. However, the effects of redlining and, in a way, de facto segregation still last not only in Redlands, but last in areas like Compton as well. Now, Compton has gone through some demographic changes through immigration and also through some other migration practices. Compton is no longer majority black, it's now majority Hispanic. But what we see is the same people, the same areas of Compton that were once majority black, and the areas in Compton in which black people were essentially forced to live in are still the same areas in which black people still live today. And what we see during the 1950s and 60s, yes, there was a great migration of black Americans to other parts of the country, but that was when black Americans were forcibly essentially forced to live in very specific parts of areas in which they were migrating to. It was not the choice of individuals to live in specific areas when you could not get a home loan to say, for example, You could not get a home loan to live in South Redlands. And if you want to live in Redlands, you would then have to live in North Redlands, because that is the way that a system of redlining and what we would call de facto segregation existed during the immigration of Black people out of the South or into Southern communities. However, this does not stop the ability of Black people to economically succeed in these areas. As we see, even in cities in the South, there are large areas in these Black-only communities in which we still see economic success. I'm going to take this time, since we have 14 minutes, and I know I have been all over the place, and we don't have our traditional slides today. But I really wanted to see where we were at in terms of any questions, comments, or concerns we currently have. And if you want to put that in the chat or just speak to them, I think this would be a good time to do so. All right, I see nothing at the moment, so I am going to continue, but I'm going to keep my eyes on the chat just in case anything comes through. But during this time of the Great Migration and the establishing of Black California settlements, what we also see, and like I said, I'll kind of say this more for the next lesson, not only do we see the start of social movements in Oakland, but we also see the start of social movements in areas such as Watts, Inglewood, Compton, California, even in the Inland Empire in Moreno Valley and San Bernardino, California. And what we're seeing here is that there is a real fight, and there's a recognition that the laws of Jim Crow and segregation of the South, even though they're not implanted in the laws of California and other areas in which Black Americans travel, there was a realization by Black Americans or by Black people that the practice of segregation had continued into California. And there was also realization, well, not even a realization, but there was a fueling of a lot of different movements, not only in California, but also the South, that segregation was a real problem, not only because it restricted the places in which you could live, and also restricted your own legal legal abilities or your own legal power, but it also socially demeans you in multiple different ways. And what we saw out of segregation, and I want to make it very clear, like I said before, yes, the South had it on the books or had it directly written into law that segregation is a policy. However, the North and the West are not in any way not guilty of not instituting segregation. There, like I said before, there was an informal, unwritten practice of segregation in the West and the Northeast and the North and the Midwest. And what we saw was that the South might have been, like I said before, the South may have been more overt in its ability or its attempts to establish or de-establish Black power or Black ability to establish their own communities. However, other parts of the country were much more covert in doing so. So what we really saw was there was not only this sense of people realizing or people identifying that they were being restricted economically, but from a social sense, there was also this practice or this feeling that there was no real ways to move within the country, or there were no real ways in which Blackness was being accepted within the country as well. And during this time, and this is also the reason why we won't talk about it as much, because like I said, I want to save the civil rights movement and all those attached movements for next week, because we just don't simply have the time. But during this time, there was this, in a way, people were being unsettled with the way that they had to conform to be a part of the country. And in the 1950s and 60s, the 1950s, if you want to know, was an era of conformity. The 1950s was, especially when it comes to some of the sitcoms of the time, the popular media, this was a time in which people were starting to live in suburbs. The idea of the housewife or the traditional nuclear family of a wife, a husband, two kids, or 2.5 kids with 2 kids and a dog or a cat was a thing. And this was also the time in which it was very much you conform, you very much stay in line. You also don't make much noise in the country. You keep yourself clean cut and you don't make too much noise. However, that changes. The 50s was that era of conformity. However, the 60s becomes an era of rebellion. And it becomes an era of rebellion for a couple different reasons. It becomes an era of rebellion in white America for other different social movements, specifically the feminist revolution, the sexual revolution, things like that. But for Black Americans, there was a practice, especially in media, specifically music, in which Black Americans had to conform themselves to the standards of white America. And the 50s was really the time in which there was a specific haircut. I'm forgetting the name of it, but this was the time and practice in which lye was starting to be used to relax people's hair. And hair was actually a big component of the civil rights and other movements in the 60s and 70s, because hair and the use of lye as a straightener or a relaxer, especially for musical performers, was seen as this way of, not only are you economically oppressing us, or you're not allowing us to establish our own economic opportunities and communities, but you're also forcing us to change our appearance to not physically appear as Black. You're forcing us to chemically change our hair or chemically change large parts about us. And it was a large practice, and the reason why I recommended the autobiography of Malcolm X is because he also talks about this process of having to straighten his hair and how demeaning it was to exist in society. And there was this rising disgruntlement with having to conform yourself to society, especially to a society that would never really accept you or was not willing to accept you, but was still forcing you to conform in some fashion. So what we saw was that not only did we see the 50s turn into this era of conformity, you saw multiple people, you saw even popular performers such as James Brown, Little Richard, who had to kind of take on this pompadour-esque look by chemically straightening their hair with lye. But we also saw that Black artists at the time were actively discouraged about talking about Black issues. And we'll talk about this when we get to the music section, but I want to kind of detail it a bit I want to set the foundation, especially going into next week, that there is an active disgruntlement which already had existed, but it's becoming more and more revved up in a way in which not only is it hair in which you would have to conform, but it was also people recognizing that they were being economically stifled in the country, no matter where they went. There was this feeling in some way that if people left the South, that they would have free opportunities to establish themselves, which in a way that they did, but when they established those opportunities and when they established those communities, like I said, when it comes to Oscarville, when it came to Tulsa, it was essentially where the government either came in and massacred people, or the government used eminent domain to end or basically de-establish your communities. So not only was it that you could not establish a community, but you yourself as a Black person could not establish yourself or establish your own, just your natural appearance. So there was this continued disgruntlement with not being able to represent yourself as who you are, and then not even being able to support yourself and your family. So what we see going from the 50s to the 60s is that there's this feeling that something needs to change. And it's not just when it comes to the establishment of Jim Crow in the South or the establishment of covert segregation in the North, Midwest, and West. It's also that there needs to be an acceptance, not just a tolerance, of Black people in their natural setting and in their natural appearance. And there needs to be an active way in which people need to look at Black Americans as who they are, and not something, or not people who need to conform to something. So to end, since we're at 525, what we really are going to go towards for our next class is we're going to continue the reasons as to why these social movements are popping up. But we're also, like I said at the beginning of this class, we need to realize that these movements were heavily organized, heavily educated, and they were heavily planned as well. These were not just groups of people coming together and magically putting all this stuff together. The March on Washington, the litany of programs established by the Black Panthers, and groups like those were not just randomly put together by just random people off the street. These were well-read and well-educated people putting together planned operatives or planned movements together to enact this change of so many people being dissatisfied. And what we really see, if we're getting anything specifically out of this kind of covering of history, is that the Great Migration at first opened opportunities, but whether they be government actors, whether they be mobs, or whether they just be people, just everyday people living in communities in which they thought would be white only, what we saw was there was an active denial of Black people once they started to get into spaces that were traditionally not held by Black people. Whether it came to the military, whether it came to just a living in community. Before this, Black people were thought of, or in many cases were relegated to living in their own areas. And this was really the first time in which, besides some areas in the North, that you saw Black people starting to enter majority white communities, and there was not a likening or a liking of that practice. So I think what we really lead up to, and we'll save a lot of things for next week, is that America had to deal with the fact that after slavery, that they thought that after slavery that Black Americans would just live on their own and they would never have to establish themselves or welcome Black America into the general overall community of America. But what I say the civil rights movement is an assertion that not only are Black people a part of this country, but you have to realize that Black people are going to be a part of the general overall community of America. And it was establishing that whether you like it or not, it was going to happen anyway. And Black Americans should not be prevented from establishing their own communities, from economically succeeding in this country and presenting themselves as who they are, because people are not comfortable with that fact. But if there are any other questions left, we are at 5:28. If not, we will end here. I will check the chat very quickly. I don't believe I see anything at this moment, unless anyone has anything to speak of at the moment. But since we are at 5:28, we will end here. Thank you once again for coming, and I'm sorry that we had to kind of change up kind of the what our directives was today. I kind of already knew coming in that it was going to be kind of tight to bring in all this stuff at once, and it's something I'm very passionate about and talking about. So we will have kind of all of our social movements, both from the 1950s all the way to the late 2000s, all in 1 week next week. And I think that might make it a bit easier for us. But once again, thank you so much. And we will end here. Bye.